Well, good day, everyone. It was a real privilege for me to actually make the cover of Aviation for Women magazine. I don't know about you, but there's something about magazines and their cover. I made the cover of another magazine only once. It was a legal magazine, and at the time, social media were not as strong as today. And I could tell you that when I shared the article and cover of Aviation for Women magazine on my personal social media, it actually got me 40,000 views and more than 1,000 interactions. So that was really surprising, very humbling, but very happy about that. And I certainly hope there was something to do with the title of it, Champion of Diversity and Sustainability, because I'm very passionate about both topics. So when I was asked to do the keynote speech of Women Aviation International virtual conference, I thought I would focus on those two topics, diversity and sustainability. So you might wonder why sustainability for aviation and aerospace, where did that really come from? Well, actually, I started my career as an environmental lawyer. That was my first job. I worked in a big law firm right here in Montreal. And back in 1995, I can tell you that there was just a handful of environmental lawyers in my city, and the world had really started to think about the climate and the environment in the mid 80s. Remember, there was this Brundtland Commission report by the United Nations called Our Common Future that was published in 1987. But it really took a long time for the whole world to come around and really care about the climate and the environment. So I worked as a lawyer, and then I worked in mining, and then in rail transportation, and then in aviation for the past 15 years. And I'm gonna, be honest with you. At first, when I was asked to join Bombardier Aerospace, I was working for the transportation division at the time. I was not so sure about aviation because of the carbon footprint of the industry and my perception that aviation lacked interest a little bit around sustainability issues. I decided to jump into aerospace and aviation, but I had the firm intention to really make an impact on its environmental commitment. So I realized actually that aviation industry was already doing a lot more than I thought to become more environmentally friendly. So first, the aircraft and services today are 80% more fuel efficient than the jets we had in the 1960s. Yes, aviation is responsible for 2% of worldwide CO2 emissions, but our industry was actually the first one to make a commitment to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% by year 2050, and that's relative to 2005. It was really the first industry to make such a bold commitment about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago now. And there was a plan. It was not just a commitment. There was a plan to say, how are we going to reduce our carbon footprint by 50%? So first, there's the biofuels. So they've been certified now. A lot of airlines are using them. They've been shown to reduce the carbon footprint of aviation fuel by up to 80% when you look at the full life cycle. So now it's more a question of price and availability before the biofuels can actually reduce CO2 emissions of the aircraft that are in service today. We've seen also more environmentally friendly aircraft come into service in the last decade, like the Airbus A220. So that's the formerly known as the Bombardier C series. It has a 20% better fuel burn, a reduced noise footprint. And I could share that it made me really personally proud to be associated with that aircraft when I worked at Bombardier and when I broadcast the first flight of that aircraft live on the web. Recent aircraft use less than 3 liters of jet fuel per 100 passenger kilometers. So that actually matches the efficiency of the most modern compact cars while traveling a lot further and a lot faster. And when you think about it, about 80% of aviation CO2 emissions are emitted from flights over 1,500 kilometers, for which there's really no practical alternative mode of transportation. Airports are getting their carbon accreditation from Airports Council International, and airlines are saving fuel through more efficient procedures and weight reduction measures. Some airlines taxi to the runway on one engine instead of using two. And it was actually under Bombardier's leadership that business aircraft manufacturers decided to join that commitment and to do their share as well to reduce the carbon emission. And that's something I personally spearheaded at the time. It was really important to me. Maybe I jumped to the slide. So I'll tell you that story maybe in a bit more detail. So I remember in 2009, we were just a few months away from the United Nations Copenhagen, what we call the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. And it was a time where activists were actually starting to target aviation as a key contributor to climate change. But the aviation and aerospace players had worked together and had made those ambitious commitment, to reduce the carbon footprint by 50% by year 2050, sorry. And there was an action plan for that. I talked to it about it. So commercial aviation was all aligned. So that was good. But I remember that I was personally in meetings where commercial aviation players were actually bashing on business aviation players. They were saying things like the leaders of the world should be prevented from attending the Copenhagen conference if they arrive in their private jet. The issue with climate change and aviation is because business aviation is the issue, that sort of thing. So for me, that was bad because Bombardier was actually manufacturing both commercial and business aircraft. And when you think about it, the business aircraft side was responsible of 0.02% of CO2 emission. So that was not the issue, but there was a big perception around that. So I just said, this got to stop. It's got to stop because I'm working for a company that does both commercial and business aviation. So I said, okay, I have to do something about this. And I have to rally all of aviation together before we arrive in Copenhagen. And so I decided to start working on that. It was not easy. I can tell you it was not easy because as a company, first we had to, get the baseline and get, what would be the target footprint for our company, by year 2050. How are we going to reduce that? Can we meet the commitment of reducing by 50%? And then I had to go around and rally all the other business jet manufacturers and say, this is really important. You need to come on board and make sure that we're all together. So it all worked out. And I'm really, really proud of that because by the time we arrive at the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties, the whole of aviation and aerospace was really speaking with one voice. We were united to say that we cared about the carbon footprint, that we're serious about it, that we were ready to reduce it. And so for me, I'm talking about this because this is really one example of how I champion sustainability for the industry. And when I joined CAE, it was a bit different because CAE is the world leader in pilot training. The fact that we're doing type rating and training pilots only on flight simulators is actually avoided, thousands of thoughts of CO2 emissions every year. But CA is also the leader in cadet training. So that's where we give young people their first pilot license. And we therefore have a fleet of about 250 small aircraft. And when I joined CAE, my company was not issuing a corporate social responsibility report. So I thought that was a little bizarre. So I went to my CEO and I said, you know what? We're a public company. We're in aerospace. We train pilots. We have to do a corporate social responsibility report. So I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to start the process, get our baseline, work on a roadmap, find allies inside the company, and then we're going to improve every year. And we did. And remember, just before the pandemic in 2009, we were seeing a lot of news articles again, and activists encouraging people to stop traveling by plane because of aviation's carbon footprint. That was obviously not in the interest of our industry. In 2009, you'll remember that there were students walking in the streets around the world, and 150,000 people were walking in the streets of Montreal alone to raise awareness about the importance to take actions on climate change, not just for aviation, but aviation was part of it. My son, he's 20 years old, participated in that demonstration. And the kids of my CEO actually asked him that day, and they said, "You know what, Dad, you're a CEO. What are you going to do to really work on climate change? You could do something." And right there, my CEO called me and he said, you know what, we need to do more. And he copied the whole executive team. And he said, we're doing a lot for the environment already, but I want us to do more. I want us to do something that will make our employees proud, that will inspire other companies to do more, and confirm to the next generation that we care deeply about the planet. So we turned around, and within a few days, me and my team and the whole team at CAE, we came back and we proposed that we should become carbon neutral on a worldwide basis in 1 year. Not in 10 years, not in 20 years, not in 30 years, in 1 year. It was really a bold commitment, but I personally championed that with my CEO, with the executive team. And we made that public commitment in November 2019 that we would officially become carbon neutral by September 2020. And we did. So honestly, I was extremely proud of that. But it would have been very easy to push that commitment aside when the pandemic hit, because compensating the residual carbon is an investment. And especially at a time when the aviation industry was decimated and the impact on our company was very, very important due to the pandemic. So it could have been easy to just say, you know what, we're going to push that commitment aside and we'll come back to it. But we made the commitment for the right reason, because we cared about the climate, we cared about the planet, and so we decided to keep the promise and the commitment. So when we announced the carbon neutrality, we told the world that we also want to be leaders in electric aircraft, that we want our fleet of small aircraft to be electric or hybrid in the next 5 years. So now we've created an incentive to basically reduce further the carbon directly at the source. So the point of these examples is really to show you that you could be a champion of sustainability in your company, in your industry. So only one person can make a difference. But I know that many, many people and many companies are doing a lot to become greener every day, every year. So our challenge, I think, is to make this more public knowledge, to make sure that each company starts talking a bit more about their environmental commitment, that everyone is actually doing something about it. So we need to be really proactive to counter the movement, asking people to stop traveling by plane because of the carbon footprint. So of course, right now it's the pandemic. Not a lot of planes are flying, but it will come back and those activists will come back. So we need really to be proud of what our industry is doing to reduce our CO2 emissions. So I'm asking you to tell your kids, to tell your families, tell your friends what our industry is doing, because I don't need to emphasize all that much that environment is really important for the next generation. And therefore, if we want to attract and retain the talent in our industry, we must be really serious about sustainability and we need to talk about it a lot. So now, I think talking about the importance of talent brings me to my second topic, diversity. And of course, I know that diversity is more than just gender diversity. There's a lot more to that. But for today, I'm just going to focus on gender diversity. So I think we can face the reality in our industry in general. Gender balance is quite a challenge. We sometimes have 20% of women in our companies, more 15% in engineering and technical functions. So not many rise to the top. But if we don't make efforts to hire more women in our industry, we're just not tapping into the full talent pool. And diversity does not happen by accident. It actually requires efforts. So at CAE, we've launched a diversity and inclusion initiative 3 years ago. And our CEO, again, said many times diversity is the right thing to do. And as a father, the last thing I would want is for my son to have more opportunities than my two daughters. So we put together an executive diversity council. We have a diversity committee. We have 6 employee resource groups. We trained our management on unconscious bias. We trained our employees on what diversity and inclusion really means. We set targets. We forced in our succession plans discussions to identify the up and coming women, and we force some robust development plans to help them progress, because sometimes people just don't see the women. So we have to just say, are you sure you don't have young and upcoming women? And make sure we just discuss that at least once a year when we do the talent review. And within 1 year, and we actually made the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index along with 230 companies around the world. We went from one vice president on the executive committee that was a woman, that was me, out of 10, now to two, and now today we're three. So we've made a lot of progress, and I'm really proud to say that just in recent weeks, we made the Gender Equality Index for the third year in a row. Not because we're perfect, because far from it, we're not, but because we're serious about it. And we have now processes in place and we're transparent about it. I'm pretty sure you're aware, and this is not me saying it, that this is really known data. When a man raises hands for a promotion, typically he has about 60% of what is required. And when a woman, on the other hand, will not consider a position unless she feels she had the full 100%. So women need a little encouragement. So these things do not happen by accident. Some leaders have to push a little harder to make sure that women have a chance to contribute to more senior position. I can admit that in my career, I benefited from that nudge. So, for example, when I was on the board of the Aerospace Industry Association of Canada, AIAC, I was identified to be the first woman chair of the board, but these were all men, all men. I was the only woman on that board. And so these men lifted me up. And a few years before that, I'm going to admit that I had declined the first vice president position that was offered to me at Bombardier. I was 36 years old at the time because I felt I was not ready. But thankfully, I had sponsors and mentors, and they allowed me to see that indeed I was ready and that I really should accept the position. Have I ever felt that it was difficult to be the only woman in the room? Of course. Again, today, almost all the time, very often. But I can assure you that if you think that aerospace and aviation is a man's world, it's even worse in mining and even in rail transportation. But I've always remained myself, very feminine, and turned the fact that I'm different into an advantage. I don't see that being a woman in a man's world or in aviation and aerospace is actually a disadvantage. I think it could be a huge advantage. And as women, I think it's very important to support each other, one another, to really help more raise to the top in our companies. And I give a lot of conferences on networking, and so we don't have time to talk about that. So maybe in the question period, you'll have questions about that. But I really think that networking makes a huge difference, and women tend to underestimate the power of the network. So making changes inside the company is important, but at CAE, we also decided to look at our customers. So of course, because we train pilots, a lot of our customers are pilots. So I'm sure you're aware, unfortunately, that only 5% of pilots are women. Not 30%, not 20%, not 10%, 5%. It's extremely low when you compare it to other professions. So C actually researched the questions to understand why. We interviewed hundreds of female pilots as well as teenagers, and we identified barriers and we got some insights. The first insight we gained was that all female pilots we spoke to had been exposed to aviation by someone they knew when they were really young, when they were kids or teenagers. All of them. And the second insight was that teenagers don't recognize themselves in the pilot industry. They don't see enough role models paving the way for them. So we decided to act on that. And we created what we call the Women in Flight Scholarship to encourage 5 women to become pilots every year. And we want these women to become role models for other women to enter the industry. We actually pay the full tuition and full training for these women. So it's an investment of about $1 million per year for CA. It's quite an investment, but we think it's very important. Because when we heard in the video application of the first women, when we did the first edition of Women in Flight, was things like, being a pilot was something that I've always dreamed of, but never realized it's something that I could actually do. Or others were saying, you know what, when I see female pilots on social media, it drives me. It's making me think that it could be me someday. So I think the importance of those role model is important. It's clear that a lot of young women still see and feel a lot of the barriers to their entry in the industry, but we could feel the energy and determination. And since we launched that scholarship already, we've seen an increase in the number of women applying in our pilot academies worldwide. And I think that's very important because we published recently our recent pilot demand outlook for the next 10 years. And despite everything that's going on with COVID right now, we'll still require 264,000 new pilots in the next decade. So we definitely need to make sure we tap into the full talent pool to make sure that we get there. And again, I think we can all play a role for this dream to become a reality for even more women and more people to inspire the next generation of pilots. So I'm asking you, to expose your daughters, your granddaughters, your nieces to aviation. Tell them your stories, share your passion, and if you can, bring them into the cockpit. Invite more women into the discussion. Spot talent in people who don't always look or think like you. Give them a little push, give them that little nudge. They might need help in believing in themselves. Diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. So hopefully, all of you listening today can take actions to actually be more inclusive. And I'm sure all of you can take actions to showcase our environmental commitment as well. So I think, all in all, we can all be champions of diversity and sustainability. Thank you.